Many people have had concerns about DNA because it is something new and it provides a lot of information, and it's information that in some cases you can't get anywhere else. And so there's concerns about how this information could be used. Today I want to talk about whether or not your DNA testing can be used by government or insurance companies in an unfavorable light against you. So the first thing I think that is important to talk about is when you are having your DNA tested, you are not having all of it tested unless you're getting a full sequence DNA. You're actually having just a small portion of it. Now, most humans share 99.9% of their DNA, and so the 99.9% that we all share doesn't matter. Everybody knows what that is because it's all the same. So really it's just that 0.1% that we don't share that is important. However, when you're taking a DNA test, you're not even testing all of that 0.1%. You're only testing a fraction of that 0.1%. There's still quite a bit of your DNA that hasn't been tested that has information that in many cases is what is going to be valuable in some of the situations we're talking about. But the more and more we learn about DNA, the more we find out that DNA is working in conjunction with a lot of other environmental factors in producing who we are. So let's go through some of the ways that government and insurance companies might want to use DNA or how they could, and whether or not these commercial tests would be helpful to them. So starting with insurance. Now, insurance, the company's goal is to make money. And they do this by looking at risk. What is the risk of something happening? And how much are we going to have to pay out because of that? And then once we start looking at a whole bunch of people, we can start to make this risk pool and get an idea of, okay, I know that this many things is going to happen each year. I'm going to have to pay out this much. So therefore, to insure that risk with all these people, I need to charge them X amount of dollars, and I will make X amount of millions of dollars at the end of the year and still be able to pay out all of these claims. So starting with car insurance. Could DNA be useful for car insurance? Well, what is being insured against? And in this case, we're insuring against car wrecks. We're insuring against trees falling on our cars. We're insuring against, any of these catastrophic things that happen. So does DNA influence that? Well, DNA doesn't really influence whether the tree's going to fall on your car. That's a matter of where you park it. As far as accident, there might be some DNA markers that have to do with risky behavior. Whether you are going to drive fast, whether you wear a seatbelt, things like that. But these are also behaviors that we can protect against. In some cases now with cars, we have the annoying beeps if you don't put your seatbelt on right away that continues to beep. I'm not sure if I even have owned a car in the last 10 years that didn't have that. And so certain safety features have been built into the vehicles which can mitigate for any of these risk factors. Now, from a commercial DNA testing standpoint, I have not seen any reports that talk about definitively risk behavior. There are some reports on 23andMe that generalize about risk, but they point out that, hey, this is involved with lots of different markers along your DNA, and there are some environmental factors with this as well. And so because the genetics of risk haven't really been characterized very well, there's really not an incentive, I think, for insurance companies to worry about this. So in this case, I don't think your car insurance company is ever going to ask you for your commercial DNA test in order to determine what your rate is. There are much better factors to determining your rate, namely how many tickets you've had, how many accidents you've had, your age, and your sex. We know that male drivers are worse than female drivers, and younger drivers are worse than older drivers. And that's really going to be the determination of your car insurance rates. So next we go on to home insurance rates. Now, this is also similar to car insurance. We are insuring against things like theft, like fire, destruction to property, anything like that for the most part don't have anything to do with genetics. They have more to do with where the home is, where it's located, your socioeconomic status, whether you smoke, things like that, that are much better indicators of what the overall risk is. And so while there may be some genetic factors, and I'm trying to think myself of anything that I've even read that might be related to homeowners insurance, this is one insurance that I can't think of a genetic component that would actually apply to it. And so I doubt you're ever going to have a homeowners insurance company ask you for a genetic profile, simply because it's going to cost them money to analyze that and determine what it is. And they're in the business of making money. And if there's very little chance that this actually affects it, they're not going to spend the money in doing that. So no, you're not going to have to worry about your homeowner's insurance being affected by any commercial genealogy test. General liability insurance. This is sort of the catch-all that a lot of businesses or individuals use, basically in case somebody sues you for something. Maybe they get injured on your property, maybe they get injured, in a car accident, and your auto insurance has certain limits, or your homeowner's insurance has certain limits. General liability insurance basically covers that. It's really cheap in a lot of cases because there's very little opportunity or chance that you're probably going to be sued for more than these limits. And so it doesn't cost that much. It gives you $1 million of coverage for a few bucks a month or so. And there's really no genetic component to it. This is really to cover anything else in life that might possibly happen, not with genetics. So no, I don't think that you're ever going to have to worry about general liability insurance asking about your genetic genealogy tests. Now we're getting into some things that might. We have disability or accidental death and dismemberment insurance. These might have a genetic component. Again, talking about risk, there are some genetics to risk, although it's not very well understood right now. But there appears to be some genetics that have an effect on your ability to handle risk or take risks, things like that. Now, disability and accidental death and dismemberment usually are not necessarily talking about things that you're doing risky, but sometimes things that just happen. There is a risk component, but there's also more of a purely accident component to it. And so because of this, I don't think that this is going to ever see a genetic component, an insurance company asking you to take a genetic test in order to do this. But now we start to get into something that we know is related to genetics: health, dental, and vision insurance. All of these have components that are directly affected by your genetics. For instance, your teeth structure and things like that. We can go and point to certain genetic markers that might influence that. Your vision, whether you're nearsighted, farsighted, or you have some other things, we can trace some of that back to the genetics that you have. And then your just overall health, that can also be traced back to certain genetic markers. The key here to remember, I think, is that most of these things are not solely dependent on genetics. Genetics may play a role, but there are other factors involved. And so when it comes to insurance and an insurance company, what they are looking for is they're looking for really the cheapest way that they can determine risk for this group. And how can you determine that? Well, we have lots of study before genetics even came about as far as body type of our health. And there's certain areas that are clear risk factors. For instance, all of your health forms almost always ask you your height and your weight, which is just a quick general measure of your overall health by calculating your BMI. It doesn't tell you everything, but it gives you a general idea of where you fit on the obesity scale. And right now in the United States, as well as in other countries, there's a significant portion of the population that is obese. It's something that's just never happened before in history. Really, I think because we've never had such access to food in history. There is that is actually a pretty good indicator of overall health outcomes because there's lots of things related to it. These forms that you fill out for these also ask you if you smoke, if you drink. These are two other factors that greatly influence other health aspects. And so by filling out this simple form, answering just those 4 basic questions, they have a pretty decent idea as far as the general risk category that you fall into. Then they can ask about your health history. what problems you've had, what problems your parents have had, what problems your grandparents have had. Because what we found over 100 years of research is that a lot of these health outcomes are inherited. Now, there may be some other factors involved with it, but that heritability actually matters. So by filling out a simple questionnaire, you can actually pinpoint where somebody fits into an overall risk category. A questionnaire is extremely cheap, whereas a genetic genealogy test, well, we know that they cost about $100. Now, if we're going to be specific to these certain aspects of this, because all of your commercial genetic genealogy tests don't cover all of the things that would be important for health, dental, and vision. If there was a test designed for that, you're still looking at $100 or so a customer, whereas a survey, you fill it out and you run it through the Scantron, you're talking pennies to actually process that. And so if we're weighing how much extra information we're going to get from a genetic genealogy test versus just a survey with questions that we know already, there's probably a few cases where we might gain some more information. But when we're talking about thousands or millions of people, a simple survey is going to cover most of the information we need for a risk factor. So in the future, if these genetic genealogy tests or just commercial genealogy tests, commercial genetic tests get more accurate as far as the research that goes into it and the amount of information that we're able to glean from that as far as determining risk, then you might see in the future for health insurance that you're being asked to take a genealogy test. But I doubt it's ever going to be the genetic genealogy test that you see from Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, simply because they are not designed or targeted to that kind of information. In the United States, there's also a law, the GINA law, that prohibits the use of certain genetic information for determining health insurance issues. Next, we get to life insurance. Now, like health insurance, there are some genetic components that influence your life expectancy. There's actually some diseases and some genetic abnormalities, genetic defects, that pretty much guarantee an early death. Now, this is in a tiny portion of the population, but these do exist still. So when we're looking at genetic tests, and particularly at these commercial genetic tests, would they be useful for a life insurance company? My gut reaction here is no. And here is why. Almost all of the markers, the SNPs that are used for these commercial genetic genealogy tests, they want to have at least a 1% allele rate. In other words, at least 1% of the people that test have the alternate allele as opposed to the majority allele. So it's something that is not necessarily common in the population, but is not super rare. Most of these genetic abnormalities that would cause premature death are extremely rare, less than 1%, less than 0.1%. And so they're not being tested by these commercial genetic genealogy companies. Now, for a life insurance company, could they design their own test to be able to do this? Absolutely. And could they ask you to do this? Absolutely. If you sign up for life insurance, they have a litany of questions. They probably have a health exam, where they take your blood, they weigh you, measure you, interview you in order to determine that risk category similar to the health insurance. And that determines what your overall rate is. The question then is would it be worth it for them to identify these specific genetic abnormalities in people so that they either have to charge a higher rate or don't insure them? My guess is no, because once again, we're talking about insuring millions of people and spending a few $100s for, the blood testing and having somebody come out and interview you and take, whatever vital measurements they need from that is sufficient to be able to put you in a risk category, particularly when we're talking about term life insurance that you may just be having for 10 years or 15 years when you're still in your healthy young years. But this is something that, from a future standpoint, depending on how things expand, that it might be the case. Now, can any of these insurance companies ask you for your ancestry results or other results like that? Yeah, I'm sure they could ask you unless it's actually prohibited by law, but not all of them would be. And so if any of them did and you weren't comfortable with that information, you could simply go to another insurance company right now to find that. Now, the next one is the government. Could the government use this? And really, in particular, the criminal justice system. Could your Ancestry DNA or MyHeritage or 23andMe be used by the criminal justice system? Well, we already know that it has been used for finding unknown criminals with DNA that was left at crime scenes. It's been used for identifying victims that otherwise had no identification on them. So it is actively being used. Now, primarily it is with GEDmatch database and with family tree DNA. Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage do not allow police access to their database for criminal familial searching. That being said, at least in the US and most other countries in the world, there are certain procedures as far as legal procedures where they could issue a warrant for inspection of database for some reason. Now, they would have to show before a judge that this was legitimate, and the companies then, of course, have the ability to fight that. And in fact, there have been a couple of cases in the US where they were presented with a warrant that was then fought and no information was given. On the other hand, the place where I see that these are most used, would be most used from a criminal standpoint, is simply if there was criminals that actually had their DNA tested because they were interested in their ethnicity results, and now their DNA is out in those databases, and particularly GEDmatch and family tree DNA, where if a crime scene DNA was uploaded and you had a one-to-one match, then you've really found who your suspect is, or at least their identical twin, one of the two. But in any case, right now as it stands in the United States, other than through the legal process and through most countries in the world through the legal process, your DNA data that is held by Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage is not going to ever be used for anything involved in the criminal justice system. Now, I can't predict the future, and so I can't say that that's always going to be the case. We'll have to see in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years what has changed in society, what access is available, and whether any of the laws have changed as well. That might change my answer to some of these. But as of right now, I hope that that helps you understand a little bit about where some of this information can be used and where it can't be used, and where it's really not cost effective to use at all. Now, if you'd like to learn something else about DNA, then watch this video up above. But if you want to learn something more about genealogy in general, watch one of my wife's videos down below.